Tēnā koutou katoa, mihi mahana tēnei kia koutou, ko te kai whakahaere o te whare taonga o ngā parihimana o Aotearoa tēnei, ko Rowan Carroll ahau. Thank you, Paul. I recognise those who are here, why we are here, and the importance of our work. Thank you, Vernon, for asking me to share a DX session and case study with you today. One of the most challenging things I've done in my museum career is return the remains of 38 individuals who were murdered or died in tragic circumstances back to their families. But first, a quick intro to the New Zealand Police Museum. Hopefully we've got some action here. Yep. So we're located on the campus of the Royal New Zealand Police College, which is 20 minutes actually, north of the capital, and it's home to all police recruits and senior courses, and it's a 1980s architectural treasure, as you can see. It's like living in a little bit of paradise, to be honest. It's a beautiful location. So we are a social history museum that unashamedly tells the stories of our country through the police lens. The museum was originally the Recruit B Lounge. The ground floor is exhibitions and the education area, and upstairs is used as collection storage. So this is what it looked like in 2011. It was uninsulated with vast fluctuations in temperature, winter to summer, from 5 degrees to 35 degrees. The relative humidity was from 10% to 80% in any 12-month period. There was UV leak through the skylights, brittleness and fading as a result, and insufficient and poor shelving systems. So we took all of our collection out and refurbished that top floor. So the 6 small storerooms became 2 large ones that are now fully insulated with HVAC system, mobile shelving storage, wire racking, rolled racking, pallet racking, and static shelving. And so we now have a very stable environment, thankfully, and a kick-ass armoury. Okay, so what you see in front of you here is a very typical New Zealand police officer's desk clear-out box when they've retired or resigned. So finding out that there was a collection of human remains came as quite a shock. Seeing what condition the remains were in was also quite a shock. So while I said this was a typical desk clear-out, having a human foot in a boot was not typical. So taking it from that situation to this, where the human remains were cleaned, mold treated, and nested. So most of the human remains were used as evidence in court cases and then collected by police as teaching tools. For some years, the museum had displayed them in the police-only Black Museum. But for what purpose? It was simply morbid curiosity, to be frank. So over time, details and paperwork had been separated and lost regarding the remains. They were stored away in boxes, wrapped in newspaper, printing ink had transferred onto some of the bones, some were mouldy, some of the fluids had evaporated, leaving flesh exposed. We took samples of that fluid to ESR so we knew what the fluid was composed of and then that we could top up the jars. Subsequently, the remains of these people were nested in conservation boxes and pristine materials purchased specifically for them. In some cases, bones that were from one person had mistakenly been put with someone else, and it became a really important jigsaw for us to solve. Our new Koiwi Tangata store, as you can see here, followed the protocols of tikanga Māori, respect, care and love, because everyone should be given these courtesies. Little was known about these people Identifying them was the first step to returning some dignity to them. Somebody loved them, they belonged to a family, they were victims, and yet their re-victimisation continued under our watch. So after considerable research, we found out who most of our people were, and here they are. Okay, so what, as the curator, are your responsibilities? So culturally, the key word is respect, and this goes across all cultures. If you have respect in your heart and in your action, it goes a long way to fulfilling this responsibility. The involvement of local iwi and the blessing of kaumātua through every stage of work is essential, not only for the souls of the people whose remains you are caring for, but also for your own spiritual safety. As none of these people were tangata whenua, I was also supported spiritually by the non-denominational police chaplain who would often pray over me as I performed essential tasks. I'm not religious, but the fact that someone was caring for the safety of my soul throughout this process was very comforting. I don't believe in ghosts either, but I would often chat to my wards as I worked and sometimes sang. I felt it was a way of transferring some love to these people who had been victims and who had laid abandoned for decades. Morally, the key word here is consent. Unlike a medical teaching collection or an anatomy museum, the remains of these people in our care, and generally the remains of people in all museum collections, are not there with consent of the individual or of the next of kin. So let that sink in for just a moment. It is so critical. In my mind, this is wrong and a driving force behind why these people needed to be laid to rest, not to be maintained in a museum for tenuous reasons, such as training or scientific research, or even worse, the curiosity of voyeurists, whether they be museum staff or others. Let's face it, in this technology-rich world, any scenario can be created or recreated to meet the needs of training or research. Ethically, policy and transparency are your responsibility. If you don't have a section on human remains in your collection management policy, you should think about adding it in. It should cover modified human remains too, and clearly outline your museum stance to ensure the safe handling, display or not, and repatriation. Even if you don't have human remains that you know of in your collection, this will inform behaviour and make everyone mindful. It reminds me of a few years back when I often heard people in the sector say they didn't have taonga Māori in their collection, so they didn't need to have a section outlining care and protocols and the ways of working. Again, this is about respect, transparency, and acknowledging tangata whenua. Curatorially, handling the remains takes a huge amount of courage, but must be done to ensure these people's remains are cared for as you would any precious artefact. In this case, every person's remains had to be rehoused from the existing storage to being properly nested and secured, and then later into eco-friendly containers for cremation. And what about the legal situation here? Are there guiding acts? So the museum's human remains were collected between 1905 and 1956. At the time, there was no legislation relating to the collection and use of human tissue. In 1964, the Human Tissue Act was passed. It related to tissues for therapeutic purposes, such as for transplant. The Human Tissue Act 2008 repealed the 1964 Act and reflected an emphasis on consent when removing, retaining or using human tissue. The regulations related to quality, safety and other standards for collection and use of human tissue that would apply to existing holdings of human tissue such as the human remains in our collection. Number 2, there is a vacuum in terms of disposal of human tissue from historic collections. You know, there really just was nothing to guide us. However, we were guided by the intent of current legislation, so intent is important. There are key principles reflecting in more recent statutory law. In particular, the purpose of the Human Tissue Act 2008, set out in Section 3, reflects the key principles of respect and consent. The Coroner's Act of 2006 considers what happens to human tissue after the need for it to be retained has ended. Although the Act does not cover the situation we found ourselves in, the process set out for return or disposal of body parts or samples assisted us. The approach taken was to contact family members where they exist and ascertain their wishes. In other cases, appropriate arrangements should be made for disposal in a safe and culturally appropriate manner. And what about other jurisdictions? Because no specific legislation existed in New Zealand to bind our policy and procedure, an international search found that the Deutsche Museumsbund released a paper in April 2013 titled Recommendations for the Case of Human Remains in Museums and Collections. This explored the issues at great length. Germany has significant human remains collections that are unidentified as a result of the Nazi era. And while our situation is not the same, their term context of injustice is applicable. Our remains were all victims after all. So, after considering the legal implications that might guide the decision-making process, it was time to broach the subject with the New Zealand Police Executive and to recommend that the collection be repatriated. The potential here to bring police into disrepute weighed heavily, but the thought that these people were being re-victimised by not being laid to rest didn't sit well at all either. The executive paper recommended that a process was developed, including policy, a communications plan, a standard operating procedure. It also set out the intention to seek out the next of kin of the people whose remains we held. The entire police executive agreed that now was the time. These people needed to be reunited with their families and laid to rest. So, it has only been 50 to 100 years. Let's find those next of kin. So, as you can see from this list, it was clear that it wasn't a great idea in some cases to try and track people down. But in other cases, it was absolutely imperative. And when we did find them, how did we broach the subject with them? So the first thing that we needed to do was to make that initial contact. And that was usually via a phone call. Hello, Mr. Merritt. Do you know the story of your great aunt Nellie? I was really surprised at how many people had heard of these people from their family who had had a terrible event happen to them. But the actual circumstances or the outcomes were not known. It was really very common for these to be whispered about in family circles as opposed to being talked about openly. So Mr. Merritt, yes, he knew that great aunt Nellie had died in awful circumstances, but that was really all. It wasn't discussed any further. So when I related to him that we had criminal evidence from her case in our collection that I'd like to talk with him about, he was a little, curious, but also thought, well, maybe it's, an old book or something that you owned, whatever. So after that initial phone call and we arranged a meeting, I took with me a senior uniformed police officer so that now this next of kin would understand the gravity of the situation. And so we also asked that they have other family members with them to support them, and that they let wider family know that we were having this meeting also to discuss what was going to happen. So when I went to meet them, and I ended up travelling all over the country to find these families and talk to them, I always had a huge background to the case with me so that they could understand why we had their relatives' human remains in our collection. And we also prepared by making a video that set out what police's intention was in repatriating the human remains. We also prepared a media release in advance, and so they could then understand how it could play out in public. We did promise privacy for those who wished it, and that their relatives' name in case wouldn't be exposed if they felt there would be some conflict there for them. And it also ensured that no one was re-victimised or persecuted by the media. We also reassured them, once we'd established that yes, it was human remains that we had from that case, that New Zealand police would pick up all of the associated cost with that repatriation. So after all of the families were informed and the media statements concerning the project went live, and we publicly launched our background video, the Deputy Commissioner, Grant Nichols, was my media stand-up support. However, he let me front all of the national media interviews, which was a good show of support, I felt. So this is the video that we made, and I will post the link in the chat for you if anyone's interested in seeing how we went about doing that. Now, for some people, it was virtually impossible to find family. Herbert Knight, for instance, was a single male without children and no indicators of where he was born in England, according to his death certificate. He was buried in an unmarked grave at Karori Cemetery without his head. Edward Armstrong was married with 2 sons, one of whom murdered him, dismembered his body, loaded it into 2 suitcases and threw them off the Cook Strait ferry. He was found guilty of his father's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. His mother died while he was in prison, and his one and only younger brother became a teacher and later a school inspector, travelling New Zealand. This younger brother died without marrying or having children. So after serving his time, the murderer was released and then disappeared without trace. I could not find a record of him anywhere. Perhaps he'd moved to Australia, something he had planned to do before he was caught. And Edward Armstrong was also buried in a pauper's unmarked grave on a steep hillside and without any marker and without his legs. So this is Edward Armstrong's grave site. It's just an incredibly hilly place, and the caretakers at Karori Cemetery were amazing in that the grass, when I first found the site, I had to pull myself up the hill using the grass. It was that long. And they cleared it away, made paths, and they just did an amazing job for us. So here was Edwin's gravesite, now with a marker. Herbert Knight, here's his marker. We publicly notified the services for the unknown victims and targeted organisations that would have an association. For the baby, representatives from SANS New Zealand attended and gave a reading. They're an organisation that gives support to those who have lost a baby. In many ways, this grave was now a tangible place for those who had lost babies to come and grieve. We had a police guard of honour, the Deputy Commissioner smoke, along with the police chaplain and kaumātua. So for the adults, 5 of the adult remains were medical examples used for comparison with those who died violently. These skeletons probably came from India, which traded legally in body parts for medical students up until 1985. No matter where they came from or how, they are the remains of human beings and they deserve our respect and empathy. Although we couldn't establish it, these people had parents, possibly siblings, possibly children. They would have been loved, and yet they were lost. By burying these people, we created a tangible place to grieve for all those who have lost loved ones and have never known what has become of them. This is Linwood Cemetery, and in the case of Nellie Mowat, her parents' grave, the headstone had been toppled and broken in the earthquake, and so we had the headstone fixed and we added Nellie's name down to the bottom of it and connected her back with her parents. The Lakeys were murdered by their neighbour. Their estate was settled and all proceeds sent to Sam's mother in the UK. Christabel was buried in an unmarked grave in Huntley Cemetery. So we reunited Sam and Christabel, and they finally had a marker to acknowledge their tragic deaths. So how did all of this go down? It was actually overwhelmingly positive. Police from across the districts participated in the services and from all ranks and roles. Deputy commissioners, district commanders through to constables stood as honour guards, pallbearers and participants in the ceremonies. Where the families gave permission, media reported on the stories of the people, discussed the reasons why we had these people's remains in the first place and why we were returning them now. There was absolutely no negativity from the families or the wider public. In fact, we were picked up by overseas media and social media and described as being the most respectful people in the world. So repatriating human remains to families requires intense research, time, authority, tact, personal commitments to the families, and detailed practical communications with local authority staff, the coroner's office, funeral directors, monumental masons, aviation security, letting them know in advance you're carrying human remains in your carry-on luggage, so therefore no surprises, and most importantly, the families to find out what they want for their family member. So my recommendation to you, be brave, do the groundwork and preparation before going public. Tell the families first and allow them to disseminate the information to their wider family long before you go public. Approach it with humility and honesty and respectfully. Follow the family's wishes, pay the cost, show the world this is not a dirty secret, but a situation that can be handled with dignity and pride. He kono mai I roto ina mihi, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rowan.
Quite all right.
That was an amazing look at what's a very challenging area of collection care. I wondered, first we'll put out to questions to the general audience, which you can post by chat, and then I can relay those to Rowan if there's any that come through. But I wondered first whether you've ended up with many human remains that you're still left caring for.
We actually, it's interesting, New Zealand Police have started working through their evidence storage, and so I am thinking there may be more human remains coming our way in the future. We were requested to keep one set of human remains, and that was from the Bolton case, which was in 1956, the last person who was hanged for murder. And the family don't believe that Walter committed the murder against his wife. So they've asked me to keep her human remains in case they go and try to get a reprieve or a pardon for him. So our collection management system policy says that we don't collect human remains. However, not proactively. We would never do that now. But if it comes to the point where we need to be the ones who are caring and repatriating for people who are in the police system for whatever reason, then of course we will do that.
Yes, I guess that's a whole parallel area, is the evidence collection, that you've got cases where they will need to be kept because the case is unresolved.
Correct. Yeah. And this isn't something that we are alone in. There are many human remains in many collections across New Zealand. So I think this is why we needed to put a spotlight onto this. And I think that there are others who really need to face the fact that they need to make these decisions and do something proactive about them.
Would you be open to other museums contacting you in regards to the processes that you followed if they're wanting advice?
Yes, most definitely, and we have already, but certainly we're here to help. And I think having a really positive model and way of doing things will be helpful. It will give people courage to actually do it, I think.
That's great. Okay, well, if there are any clients that would like further information about the processes that the NZ Police Museum have gone through, then get in touch with us and we'll pass you on Rowan's contact details.
Thank you.
We had one question from the Museum of Transport and Technology. They were curious as to how you actually flagged those records in Vernon, whether there was any way that you flagged the catalogue records themselves.
We actually, because we do have a lot of disturbing content in our museum, we do have a system. And actually we were looking at the Code of Ethics for Museums Aotearoa recently, and Jess, who looks after our collection, is actually putting forward some proposals about how we protect staff in situations like this. And so, yeah, we do have a lot of heads up triggers and flags in our collection management system, just to alert people that they are entering into difficult territory.
Yes. So thank you very much, Rowan, for your contribution today. In Vernon CMS, there's a couple of ways that you can mark and restrict access to objects that have certain sensitivities or restrictions that apply to them. One example would be objects that have cultural sensitivities, like this particular sculpture. We can make use of the administration window and the restriction type field. You can create terms that make sense for your collection and add any other specific notes in the column that's beside that. Here we've marked that this particular object is culturally sensitive. We can, if we wish, create symbols to represent that description and display those wherever the object is accessed. And so in my case, if I look at the authority term for culturally sensitive, I've created a symbol of R for restriction as the short name. I've then altered the one-line summary for the object so that that short name for restriction type is right at the start of that one-line summary. And it means that whenever I search for objects, I'll be able to see that symbol at the start. So if I search for something generic like figure, I'll be able to see the objects that have restrictions that apply to them immediately in that pop-up. You may wish to go a step further and control data access for these objects. An example would be human remains, where there may be sensitivities around the data itself. You may not wish the general staff to know about the catalogue records or to have full access to them. In that case, we can set up data security restrictions based on the terms that are used in a particular field. So we saw that culturally sensitive is one of the available terms, and that has a short alphabetic code of CUL. Often those terms will have numeric IDs. We can then, in Vernon's data security, set restrictions based on that particular term ID. And so that's done through system maintenance, security tool, and within the data file security for the object file. So I've created a security group which I've called Social History Cataloger, and rather than simply saying yes or no in terms of whether they can modify records or view them, I've said that actually that access depends on something. And so this is a built-in security check within Vernon, the security object depends check, and we just can set up a simple rule saying what field are we checking, what ID of terms are we looking for in that field, and then a simple 0 or 1 to indicate whether those are records they're allowed or not allowed to access. So this particular check is looking at the restriction field for CUL, which was culturally sensitive, and the 1 indicates that those are records which they're not allowed to access. And so I've set those restrictions on create, view, and modify. So we could log on into the system as a user that belongs to that particular group. So I'll log out of the system, and I've got an example user, Brian James, and I'll log on and see how those security restrictions affect his access to the data. So we can first try and open up that same sculpture that we were looking at before. So that was object ID 105. And if I try and open that record now, because the restriction flag is there and matches the things that the social history cataloguers aren't allowed to access, I'm just blocked completely from opening that record. There's other ways which I might come across that record, and an example would be a saved list that somebody else has already made. So a saved list may actually include some of those records. I have already created an example list with those records. So let's just try and search for those. So I could search for all of the objects that are restricted. So anything that's got a restriction, just by saying with restriction as a search. And I've currently got 3 records that match that, and one of them is the fetish figure which I was looking at first. So now if I try and view those, object 105 is in that list, and so the actual list still exists. We haven't modified that in any way, but when I try and open that record, all of the information is greyed out and we don't have access to view that. So Vernon can control access to records by that kind of depends check, and it can also do that at field level. There may be just some of the information on that record which is sensitive and you want to protect that, so perhaps only the location of the object is sensitive and the general description of the record may be okay. So that's a quick summary about how you can make use of the restriction field on the catalogue record to control access to those records within your system.